Alright guys, let's start our next topic, which is constructor classification and object initialization. How many types of constructors we have? We have total three type of constructor: default constructor, non-parameterized constructor, and parameterized constructor. We will try to make understanding between their differences, but before that, back to the previous question. The question was, let's suppose if I don't want to execute common task on each object. In that case, I don't want to define the constructor in my class, right? And when I create the object here, and constructor will call, because constructor is missing in class, it will start giving me error. So how we will deal with this? So for that reason, they come up with a rule. They come up with a solution. They said that, okay, if your class will not consist of any constructor, then compiler will automatically create a constructor in your class, and that constructor is known as default constructor. That means there is no use case when constructor will not be there in your class. Every time, whether you are defining or not defining, constructor will be always there in your class, because they need that constructor. Because every time when object will create, you need object reference, and that reference you will only get by constructor. So if you are defining constructor and your constructor is going to execute, then JVM will pass the object reference through your constructor, through your custom constructor. But if you are not defining any constructor, then compiler will create the default constructor and JVM will pass object reference through that default constructor. And ultimately you will always get the object reference whether you are defining constructor in your class or you are not defining your constructor in your class. But if you want to initialize your instance data members or class level data members at the time of object creation, for that reason you might be need to use parameterized constructor. However, you are going to better understand non-parameterized and parameterized constructor by implementation. So any class type of object reference will be stored in the same class type of reference variable. That means if you are creating constructor IMPL object, then you must have to store the reference of constructor IMPL in constructor IMPL type of reference variable only. And because more than one variable inside same method doesn't allow to have same name, that's why I am declaring first variable as object 1 and another variable as object 2. These are the name of variables, and because these variables are specifically defined to hold the object reference, that's why we call them reference variables. So reference variables are nothing but hold the object references. Those variables can be of any class type. Now sometimes interviewer asks you that where object reference holds. Don't think that object reference holds on stack only, because I am holding the object reference inside a local variable object 1 or object 2, and these variables taking place inside stack. That doesn't mean that object reference can only hold on stack. Yes, it can hold in stack, but it can also hold in other memories. Just assume that this variable is not declared here. Let's suppose this variable is declared at class level as an static data member or instance data member. In that case, if you will instantiate that variable, then the object reference will hold basis on the scope of the variable. If you declare the variable as static at class level, that means that static variable taking place inside class area. In that case, object reference will store in class area. And if you are declaring the variable as instance data member at class level, means object reference can also hold in heap. So guys, object reference can hold inside local variable, means on stack, inside another object, means on heap, or inside class area, means in static data member. It totally depends what type of variable you have declared to hold the object reference. Guys, non-parameterized constructor you will always define when you want to execute something on each object creation, such as database connectivity, that you want to execute every time on every single object creation. Similarly, there could be different tasks that you want to execute every single time on object creation. Then you will take the help of non-parameterized constructor. You will simply create it, define that code inside there, and then every time whenever you will create object, that code will automatically get execute. Now let's move to the another type of constructor, which is parameterized constructor, and let's try to understand what is the need of parameterized constructor. In this implementation, I have a class person1 which is holding two instance data member name and age, and I want to initialize these name and age on object creation every single time. Okay, I don't want to create object without initializing these values. So what I am doing, I have created one constructor where I am taking two formal arguments, name and age, and assigning these parameters value to my instance data members. So that whenever I'll create the object without passing these values, no one will be able to create the object for person one class, and these two will be initialized. And then I'm calling get name and get age method to get the name of first person and the age of second person. Okay, so if you'll see this, it is simply printing the name of first object and age of second object. If you closely observe, that person class object is formed by two instance data members, name and age. Okay, so if I am initializing these variables, that means indirectly I am initializing the object, because object is containing two data members only, right? So initializing objects instance data members is nothing but known as object initialization. And you can see in this implementation, I am initializing object by using this constructor every time, right? And that's the main reason that we are using constructor here. Yes, constructor is also used for object initialization. So constructor is used for two purposes. One is to execute some common task that you want to execute on each object creation. Second is you also need to use it to initialize object. Sometimes you just want to initialize the object instance data members at the time of object creation, then you will take the help of parameterized constructor. That is the main purpose of parameterized constructor. Now again we are seeing the same implementation, but this time class name is person2, initializing object by using constructors. Now let's try to understand another angle of this implementation. I want to this time initialize person class object without any values. I just want to create the object, but I don't have values while creating the object. So I want to make name and age optional. If I have the values, I want to initialize them, but if I don't have the values, the object will create without instantiating name and age. That also I want to enable. Now if I directly want to create the object without passing the parameters, because you are not passing the parameters, this constructor is not going to invoke. Then whether default constructor will invoke? No. That's the main point here. Always remember, when you are not creating any constructor in your class, then only a default constructor will create for you. But if you are having even a single constructor in your class, default constructor will not create for you. And in that case, if you will just try to create the object without passing parameters and expecting that default constructor will invoke, that will not getting execute. That is not going to create for you. So how you will deal with this type of situation? In that particular case, when you want to create object without instantiating the properties, you have to create a blank, empty, non-parameterized constructor to handle that situation. So I have one constructor here which is not having any parameters. I just create it just to avoid that error. So that if I run this, for this object creation, this non-parameterized constructor will invoke. That's the technical difference between non-parameterized and default constructor. Always remember, default will only creates when you are not having any constructor in your class. Non-parameterized constructor is a constructor which is similar to default constructor, but that is created by programmer to avoid this type of situations. So we are done with non-parameterized constructor, parameterized constructor, and default constructor. And we have understanding with object initialization. You will find these implementations here in day 3 oops 1 folder. All these implementations we have already discussed, and reference notes you will find the constructor related theory and that diagram that we already have discussed in our previous video.